Hello there, this is the video for the 4.09 lesson, The Beginning of Change. Almost 2.5 centuries of race-based slavery left a legacy of misery, poverty, prejudice, and fear for blacks and whites in the United States. Despite attempts to address race-related issues in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, most blacks remained politically powerless and caught in a cycle of poverty and debt. World War II brought sweeping changes, and by the time the war was over, African Americans' expectations of their country had changed. Blacks and whites sympathetic to their cause began to challenge the racial status quo of the 1940s and early 1950s. Goals for this lesson. Summarize the hardships African Americans faced in the years before World War II. Identify individuals whose actions challenged the racial status quo during the 1940s, and explain the significance of the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education. And be sure to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key, and then we can begin today's work. We're reading pages 800 through 809 and then some online activities. So page 800 here is just the beginning of the chapter with your timeline of significant events. And here's a picture of a Freedom March. And let's start reading with the Civil Rights Movement. July 2nd, 1946, Election Day in Mississippi. Medgar Evers, a young veteran of World War II, celebrated his 21st birthday by strolling up to the local courthouse to cast his first vote. Evers had fought for his country in France. He and a young Frenchwoman had fallen in love. But in the 1940s, it was both unthinkable and illegal for a black man to bring a white bride back to the Deep South, so he had come home alone. On the ballot in Mississippi that day was U.S. Senator Theodore Bilbo, a white supremacist. Evers and his older brother Charles intended to vote for Bilbo's opponent in the Democratic primary. But on the steps of the courthouse they encountered 20 white men carrying shotguns and pistols. The mob refused to let the brothers enter. The county sheriff looked on, unwilling to intervene. After a tense standoff, Medgar Evers turned to his brother and said, "Come on, Charlie, let's go. We'll get them next time." On that day in 1946, 80 years had passed since the abolition of slavery. Yet because of persistent racism, African Americans were still denied many political, social, and economic rights. After World War II, however, a new generation of African Americans began to forcefully demand their rights. This generation, who had lived and fought through World War II, a war for democracy, as they were reportedly told, would no longer submit to subjugation at home. Building on a legacy of resistance and struggle, they initiated a non-violent revolution that in the 50s and 60s brought the United States closer to the realization of the creed that all men and women were created equal. And let's look at this picture here on the bottom. At the University of Oklahoma, G.W. McLaurin, an African-American student, had to sit in the hall instead of in the classroom. Civil rights and wrongs before World War II. For much of the first half of the 20th century, the promise of American life remained unrealized for most African Americans. Jim Crow laws, under the pretense of separate but equal, subjected Southern blacks to a way of life inferior in every way to that of whites. Few were allowed to vote. State laws prevented interracial marriage. Blacks and whites were segregated, kept physically apart in schools, hospitals, buses, trains, and anywhere else where people might mix. A black person walking along a sidewalk was expected to step into the street to let a white person pass. The state of Alabama made it a crime for blacks to play checkers in public with whites. In Georgia, the courts provided 2 Bibles for witnesses to swear on, one for whites, another for blacks. In northern states, where fewer blacks lived, discrimination was less formal but still powerful. Many restaurants, bars, hotels, theaters, and amusement parks barred entry to blacks. In many northern states, schools were still segregated. In both the North and the South, blacks faced discrimination in employment and housing. With inferior schools and little chance for any but the most menial jobs, blacks had little chance for upward mobility. Any African American who overstepped the color line or tried too hard to improve his lot faced the threat of violence. Though the annual number of lynchings fell in the late 1930s, violence against blacks remained a persistent threat, especially in the South. In Congress, anti-lynching bills consistently failed to win approval over the objection of Southern lawmakers. In the decades before World War II, many African Americans tried to throw off the invisible shackles that had replaced slavery's chains. Their approaches varied widely. Booker T. Washington argued that blacks could achieve equality by accepting their social inferiority while working patiently for gradual economic self-betterment. W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founder of the Niagara Movement and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, commonly called the NAACP, led efforts to secure civil rights in the courts. Marcus Garvey, founder of the United Negro Improvement Association, rejected the ideals of both Du Bois and Washington and called instead for blacks to take pride in their race and build their own separate political and economic institutions. Throughout this period, black churches, particularly Baptist and African Methodist Episcopal congregations, flourished in rural and urban communities alike. These churches provided a supportive community that helped many blacks cope with the everyday trials of Jim Crow. Changes in the Cotton Belt. Before World War II, in the South's farm-based economy, whites owned nearly all the land, while blacks worked as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. As long as this economic arrangement endured, African Americans had little hope for social advancement. In the 1930s, the New Deal brought changes that shook the sharecropping economy. New Deal programs sought to boost the price of agricultural products by paying farmers to cut their production. Southern farmers accepted federal subsidies and reduced the amount of acreage on which they produced cotton, tobacco, and rice. In cutting back production, these farmers fired many black sharecroppers. Rising crop prices allowed white farmers to buy tractors and mechanical cotton pickers, a development that further decreased the need for human labor and pushed more black farmers out of work. Many African Americans had no choice but to leave their rural homes to look for work in the cities, both southern and northern: Atlanta, Birmingham, New Orleans, Memphis, New York, Chicago, Gary, and Cleveland. They found jobs at the bottom of the social ladder, but even those jobs paid better than sharecropping. In southern cities, a few blacks earned enough to pay the discriminatory poll tax that had kept them from voting. World War II: changes for African Americans. World War II set powerful currents of change in motion. The lure of jobs in defense factories led to a surge in the Great Migration northward. Alone or in families, hauling a bag or nothing at all, riding in buses and trains, some 700,000 African Americans left the South during World War II, with many more to follow. In the North, blacks met with racial hatred, violence, and discrimination. But at least most blacks in the North could vote without having to overcome the many obstacles that kept Southern blacks away from the polls. From New Jersey to Illinois and from Indiana to California, as the number of African American voters increased, blacks could make a difference in a close election. By the war's end, some northern politicians started paying serious attention to black demands. More than 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces in World War II, most in all-black units, including the famous Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion. Many went to war because they were drafted or because military pay was higher than what they could earn at home. Others signed on out of a sense of duty and in the spirit of what the Pittsburgh Courier, an influential African American newspaper, called the Double V: victory over the Axis abroad and victory over racism at home. The Courier argued that by their example, black servicemen could build a powerful case for racial justice. The more we put in, a black columnist wrote, the more we have a right to claim. For most African American troops, although their time in the military reflected the segregation of peacetime, many found a sense of purpose that gave them the confidence to compete in a white-dominated society. After the war, one veteran from Mississippi reflected, "You were always told that you can't do it, you can't do. But with the war," he said, "you could feel that you could do it." After the war, opponents of Jim Crow found an unexpected ally in President Harry Truman. The president issued a strong call for anti-lynching legislation, guarantees of voting rights, and bans on discrimination in hiring and public accommodations. Southerners in Congress blocked Truman's proposals, but in 1948 he responded with far-reaching executive order that banned segregation in the armed services. Although it took years for the order to be fully implemented, the desegregation of the military offered blacks an important opportunity for achievement and upward mobility. And here's a stop lynching button, and here is just a picture of the some African American troops in World War II. The journey of reconciliation. In April 1947, the Congress of Racial Equality, called CORE, a civil rights organization then based in Chicago, sent 16 young men, 8 black, 8 white, on a journey by bus across the Upper South. State laws in the South forbade blacks and whites from sitting together on buses, but the U.S. Supreme Court had recently outlawed segregation in interstate transportation. Now the Corps volunteers were risking prison, even physical injury, to see if local authorities would enforce the court's decision. They called their trip the Journey of Reconciliation. Their tactic was nonviolent civil disobedience, as advocated by Henry David Thoreau, who in 1846 had gone to prison rather than pay taxes to support what he viewed as an unjust war by the United States against Mexico. In the 1930s, the power of civil disobedience came to public attention when Mohandas Gandhi, who was influenced by Thoreau's ideas, used a tactic to oppose British rule in India. In undertaking an act of civil disobedience, protesters deliberately break an unjust law and willingly suffer the penalty. In doing so, they call attention to the injustice of being punished for pursuing a just cause. For those seeking civil rights in America, the tactic proved a powerful way of building public support. For 2 weeks in April of 1947, the Corps volunteers rode 26 buses in southern states and were repeatedly arrested and sometimes jailed. In North Carolina, angry whites assaulted one rider. But the protesters drew national attention to their cause and established a model for others to follow. And we'll come back to this excerpt on Jackie Robinson here. The Brown decision, an end to separate but equal. During World War II, membership in the NAACP soared from 50,000 to 500,000 by war's end. The organization's lawyers vigorously pursued legal challenges to segregation. In the 1950s, they focused on fighting segregation in public education. Black parents across the country saw education as their children's route out of poverty. Many school districts, by law or custom, placed African American children in shabby, overcrowded, black-only schools with wretched funding. The system mocked the Supreme Court's claim in its 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that black civil rights were protected so long as white and black facilities were separate but equal. NAACP lawyers organized a series of lawsuits attacking segregated schools. The black parents and students who became plaintiffs in these cases had been willing to endure economic and even physical threats. In the aftermath of World War II, many seemed willing to take these risks. One was Barbara Johns, a 16-year-old who led a student strike in Virginia to demand a decent school building for black students. The NAACP agreed to represent the students in court, but only if they would demand not just equal facilities for blacks, but integrated schools, blacks and whites together. The NAACP wanted to overturn the very essence of Plessy v. Ferguson, the fiction that blacks could be kept separate from whites, yet still be treated as their equals. The Virginia case and several similar NAACP-sponsored lawsuits challenging separate but equal schooling reached the Supreme Court in 1952. The cases were grouped under the title of the suit brought by Oliver Brown, a black father, against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Brown's 8-year-old daughter Linda was not allowed to attend an all-white school just blocks away from her home, but was bused to a black school a mile away. In the case Brown v. Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall led the argument before the Supreme Court. Marshall was the great-grandson of a slave. His father was a railroad porter. His mother taught in a segregated all-black elementary school. When he was refused admission to the University of Maryland Law School because he was not white, Marshall attended Howard University, a historically black institution in D.C. There he was influenced by Charles H. Houston, who urged his students to use the law as a means to promote social change. In 1933, Marshall graduated first in his class from Howard, and in 1936 went to work for the NAACP, where he eventually took charge of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund. In the Brown case, Marshall and his colleagues presented evidence that while schools set aside for African American children were separate, they were far from equal. They also cited psychological studies suggesting that segregation in itself caused black children to feel unequal and socially inferior. After months of argument, on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court issued its unanimous ruling. Writing for the court, Chief Justice Earl Warren declared that to separate black children from others of a similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way that never to be undone. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And we'll stop here on this video and start up with the second part shortly.